Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Avalon Sexual Assault Center's Bringing Down Barriers Sexual Assault Awareness Month Lunch and Learn series. We're so excited to be able to offer this series in collaboration with our wonderful community partners to learn about the specific vulnerabilities that communities experience in relation to sexualized and gender-based violence, barriers to accessing services, and ways that we can make changes individually and organizationally to better support the needs of survivors. Avalon Center is located in Chibuktuk, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Acknowledging our presence on this land is particularly important when holding conversations about sexualized and gender-based violence, which have historically been and are currently still today tools of colonization and violence against Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. We invite you to reflect on the land on which you currently reside and join us in standing in solidarity and action with residential school survivors, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and their families, land and water protectors, and Indigenous people and communities across this country. We are all treaty people and have an active role to play in reconciliation. April 2021 is the 20th anniversary of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, a time to honor the voices and experiences of victims and survivors, and to bring awareness to issues relating to sexualized violence. Everyone has a role to play in ending sexual assault, harassment, and abuse, and we thank you for being present here today to learn with us. Before we get started, I want to direct you to the question and answer button, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar. There will be time for questions and answers, so please ask away either using that feature or in the chat box, which I will be monitoring. There is also live closed captioning available, which you can turn on by pressing the CC live captioning button on the right side of the bottom of your Zoom taskbar. When the webinar is complete, an evaluation survey will pop up that we hope you can take a minute to fill out. This will help us evaluate this series and also plan for future events. Thank you in advance. I also want to acknowledge that discussions about sexualized and gender-based violence can be challenging, especially for survivors in this virtual room. So in the chat box, I'll be posting a link for a resource that can take you to several grounding activities that may help if you're feeling overwhelmed. Please take care of yourself in this space and afterwards. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Ash, the Executive Director, and Sara, the Peer Mentor at Coverdale Courtwork Society, who are here to share about the experiences of 2SLGBTQ folks who are incarcerated. Thank you.
Thanks, Dee. Welcome, everyone. It's always so strange when you can't see the people that you're talking to. So hi to everyone who is out there. It is wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic and making time in what I'm sure are incredibly busy schedules to join us to learn a little bit more about this subject. So today we are going to be talking about the experiences of 2SLGBTQ folks in the criminal justice system in Nova Scotia, in particular in prisons and jails. So over the next 15 minutes, which I'm going to time myself, I will go through some research and data just on this topic more broadly. And then I will finish off by sharing the research that we did at Coverdale with regards to this subject matter. And then we'll move on to some of the questions that Dee has for us and hear from our amazing Sara. So first and foremost, I guess to frame the conversation, it's important to consider why prisons are a queer issue. So Mogul, Ritchie, and Whitlock have done extensive research on this subject and looking at sort of queer injustice and the experiences of queer and trans people in prisons and jails throughout the United States. So ultimately, what we know is that the policing of sexual and gender deviance, in quotations, is central to notions of crime. It serves as a tool of race-based law enforcement and also as an independent basis for punishment. So ultimately, by bringing queer experiences, and in particular those of 2SLGBTQ folks, people of color, immigrants, sex workers, youth, and low-income people to the center, we're able to gain a more complete understanding of the ways in which race, gender, national origin, class, ability, and immigration status drive constructions of crime, safety, and justice. So the existing research on the experiences of this population within the criminal justice system are lacking, for lack of a better word. There are some pieces of research that exist in the Canadian context, but unfortunately and largely most of the research and the data that we have comes from the US context. So some of the existing research that exists and the research that I'll be citing, it comes from these sort of four sources. So first is the Trans Pulse Project. This was out of Ontario. It's a community-based research project. It investigated the impacts of social exclusion and discrimination on the health of trans people in Ontario. So in 2009, they surveyed 433 participants, and in 2019, they surveyed over 2,000 participants. Black and Pink is an organization in the US. It's a national organization, and they are particularly interested in the experiences of 2SLGBTQ folks in prisons and jails. They did an amazing national survey called Coming Out of Concrete Closets. It was the largest ever collection of information from LGBTQ prisoners. Over 1,000 prisoners across the US submitted surveys. There were 133 questions, so it's quite comprehensive. And then there's the National Center for Transgender Equality. This was a 2018 report, and they paid particular attention to the experiences of incarcerated trans individuals. And also, we gathered some data from the General Social Survey on Canadian Safety and Victimization, which is from 2014. So just more broadly, to give a bit of an overview of the experiences of 2SLGBTQ folks in Canada with regards to sexualized violence outside of carceral institutions. Canadians aged 18 years and older were much more likely than their heterosexual counterparts to be victims of violent crime. So this is for LGBT folks. And in addition to that, even after controlling for other factors like age, marital status, history of homelessness, child abuse, the odds of being a victim of violent victimization were 2 times higher among lesbian, gay, or bisexual Canadians than their heterosexual counterparts. And bisexual individuals were almost 9 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. And among those who reported experiencing discrimination, lesbian and gay individuals were significantly more likely than their bisexual and heterosexual counterparts to perceive the discrimination as being based on their sexual orientation. So just based on some of this information, we can ascertain that sexualized violence impacts the 2SLGBTQ community, is significantly different than heterosexual and cisgender communities. Very quick overview of law and legislation in Canada. So in 1890, it was a crime to be gay. In 1953, that was extended to lesbians. It justified the repression of the 2SLGBTQ community. In 1969, there was a bill introduced, Bill C-50, that decriminalized homosexuality. In 96, Parliament added sexual orientation to the Canadian Human Rights Act. In 2015, Bill 82 abolished surgical requirements in order to change gender with vital statistics. And in 2017, Bill C-16 came in, and this introduced gender identity and gender expression as federally protected grounds in the Canadian Human Rights Act. And this ultimately sparked changes to policies within Correctional Services Canada and some of our provincial facilities around where, in particular, trans prisoners are placed. So prior to 2017, you were placed in a facility where basically trans people were incarcerated based on their sex at birth as opposed to their gender identity. So following 2017, that has changed. So based on the Trans Pulse survey, what we can learn from that is that trans Ontarians experienced high rates of unemployment, workplace discrimination, poverty, which makes them more vulnerable to incarceration. Approximately 1/4 of trans people in Ontario report being harassed by police because they are trans, while about 1/4 of racialized and 1/3 of Aboriginal trans people report police harassment because of race or ethnicity. And sort of the very limited research conducted on the prison experience of trans people in Canada suggests that trans people who live in poverty, who are sex workers, and who use drugs frequently report police harassment and may constitute the majority of trans people who are arrested and imprisoned. And of course, we know that Aboriginal and Black people are vastly overrepresented in Canadian prisons and in our criminal justice system more broadly. So what do we know about sexualized violence in prisons in Canada? Well, according to CSC, Correctional Services Canada, incident reports that were provided to our correctional investigator indicated that 73 federal prisoners reported a sexual assault or instance of coerced sexual contact between 2014 and 2019. The investigator also found that 85% of cases were prisoner on prisoner, 12% were prisoner on staff, while just one incident was listed as staff on prisoner. And 1/3 of incidents originated in women's institutions, even though just 5% of the incarcerated population are women. So what do we know about the experiences of 2SLGBTQ folks and with regards to sexualized violence in prisons? We know that this population are disproportionately targeted by staff and other prisoners. We know that they are more likely to be assaulted, coerced, and harassed than their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. Sexual orientation was the single greatest determinant of sexual abuse in prisons. Rape victims of all sexualities are framed as queer and become targets of further violence in institutions. And of course, just as in the community, many do not report for fear of retaliation, stigma, and isolation. We also know, based on the research, that sexual violence is used as a tool by staff and prisoners to enforce gender roles and conformity. Male prisoners' rank is also in the carceral context measured by traits that are stereotypically associated with masculinity, including physical strength and physique, ability to commit acts of violence, and the nature of their offense. And that traits stereotypically associated with femininity are synonymous with weakness and ultimately devalued. Transgender men and women find themselves at the bottom of the prison hierarchy and become easy targets of sexual abuse. And trans women are the ultimate target for sexualized violence, in particular in male-designated prisons, where they are singled out and threatened in women-designated prisons. So again, prior to 2017, a trans woman would have been incarcerated in a male facility. So the violence that predates 2017 would have been particularly disturbing. We know that the sexual assault and abuse of women, including lesbians and gender nonconforming individuals, has not prompted the same attention and outrage as with men's prisons. So in particular, we will hear from Sara with regards to the ways in which sexualized violence within women's prisons has been largely ignored. We know that sexual abuse and the assault of prisoners by prison staff is commonplace and pervasive. So prisons are sites of violence where violence is allowed to sort of fester and pervade the system. We know that lesbians and other women who transgress gender boundaries are at a heightened risk of torture and ill treatment, of segregation. Perceived or actual sexual orientation is also one of 4 categories that makes a female prisoner a more likely target for sexual abuse. And women and trans people in prison suffer from additional forms of sexual degradation, including excessive, abusive, and invasive searches, groping of genitalia, repeatedly watching them while showering, undressing, or using the bathroom. And prisoners must submit to non-consensual sex acts with guards or other prisoners for safety or other survival needs. And we know that queer and trans prisoners are perceived as not able to be raped or that they deserve to be raped. And this is particularly true in the research for men. We also know that prisoners who report sexual violence fail to receive protection within the facilities. They are subjected to retaliation. So if they report sexualized violence, they could be written up for violating rules which ban consensual sex. So for those that don't know, sex and any type of sexual act is forbidden in carceral facilities. There are inadequate grievance procedures, which I'm sure Sara will discuss. Forcible sex is used to reinforce authority and power. Sexualized violence is an entrenched and intractable feature of prison life, and the equation of sexual violence in prisons with homosexuality, coupled with disproportionate rates of Black and Indigenous people inside prisons, makes for an incredibly toxic brew of criminalizing imagery. So we can think of sort of racial construction of the aggressive female homosexual, for example. So we also know from the research, I'm just gonna check my time here, that being LGBTQ in a US jail or prison often means daily humiliation. We know that a history of bias, abuse, and profiling toward 2SLGBTQ folks by law enforcement, along with high rates of poverty, homelessness, discrimination, in school or in the workplace has contributed to disproportionate contacts with the justice system, leading to higher levels of incarceration. And we learned that transgender people are nearly 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than the general prison population, with an estimate 40% of transgender people in state and federal prisons reporting a sexual assault in the previous year. So again, this particular data is US based. And in the same federal survey, prisoners who identified as LGB were approximately 3 times as likely to report sexual abuse as other prisoners. So we have this great data in the US context, and we can certainly, apply it to Canada, but there just isn't enough, research or data on this particular subject. So we also see strip searching in prisons as state-inflicted sexual assault. So strip searching is obviously commonplace in prisons and jails, but it is not consensual. And so we sort of see the structural violence that occurs behind prison walls as is replicated in our communities. And searches, of course, can be especially traumatic for trans prisoners who are often searched by someone of a different gender, or sometimes searched simply so that prison staff can see their genital characteristics, or for the purpose of humiliating or harassing them. And on the contrary to that, what we heard in our own research was staff refusing to do strip searches, and also, they're just being conflict around who is going to actually do the strip search for trans prisoners. So the Black and Pink survey coming out of Concrete Closets, in that survey, they found respondents were over 6 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than the general prison population. All of the respondents had, of course, experienced strip searches. And in that research, people identified as, you know, for example, being strip searched too many times to count. Who keeps track of that? So sort of this normalization of people's bodies being violated. The prisoners are in the survey were over 3 times more likely to have committed sexual assaults on LGBTQ prisoners than prison staff. And the vast majority of respondents experienced discrimination and verbal harassment by prison staff. More than a third were physically assaulted by prison staff. So the recommendations from the Black and Pink report were to eliminate solitary confinement, end strip searches, permit consensual sex within the prisons as sort of a harm reduction measure, provide full care for people living with HIV and Hep C, hold all prison staff accountable, including clear paths to termination for those who harass, physically or sexually assault prisoners, and institute community-based transformative justice practices to create healing from harm and violence and to prevent the violence before it occurs. So of course, just some facts here, many incarcerated people do engage in consensual, loving sexual relationships and friendships. And we see this as, you know, as sort of a resistance within the prison system. The ban on sexual activity can be conceived as serving a very potent purpose. So the eradication, containment of control of what is perceived as homosexuality inside prison walls. Prisons are locations of magnified policing and punishment of sexual and gender nonconformity, and trans prisoners, of course, as I've said, are at increased risk of discrimination, policing, punishment, and violence, both in the community and once inside prisons and jails. So very quickly, I know I'm out of time here, but at Coverdale, we engaged in a research study to really try and form some data on this issue. So we interviewed 30 participants, various genders, various sexualities, various races, and various interactions with the justice system. All 30 participants had interactions with police. 11 were incarcerated federally and designated women's prisons. 30 were incarcerated federally and designated men's prisons, and 27 had experienced provincial detention. So ultimately, what our research confirmed was everything that we've already discussed in comparison to the US research and what we do know about the Ontario criminal justice system. So structural exclusion, certainly that leads to housing and homelessness, unemployment, arrest, and incarceration experiences there were labeled as particularly violent and discriminatory. Poor access to healthcare within the facilities, in particular for trans prisoners. And with regards to sexualized violence, 20% reported experiencing sexualized violence inside prisons and jails, and 80% noted that they had experienced sexualized violence outside of the criminal justice system, meaning that 100% of the 30 people that we interviewed identified as being a victim or survivor of sexualized violence. Okay, thank you. That is it for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Ash. That's such important work. Thank you for the background and also the region-specific data that you've collected. I think it's so important and we have a lot of work to do, which I'd love to ask both you and Sara more about after we hear from Sara.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks, Ash. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about my lived experience as a lesbian survivor in the criminal justice system. also about my advocacy work within the prison, and then I'm going to go on to my current work. So as a lesbian in the federal system, it's very difficult because you're automatically perceived by staff and viewed as a predator, because if you're a lesbian or gay, you automatically must want everybody there. So you have that target on you immediately. And, you know, other inmates and staff use that to their advantage as well. Say, so you're in a housing unit and another inmate doesn't get along with you. What they'll do is they'll just make something up saying that you came on to them or something like that and get you moved. And because of your sexual orientation, it's automatically believed whether it's true or not. And that's so frequent in there. And, you know, they laugh about it because they know what's going on and they know it's not true, but they still, and, you know, often this leads to segregation and charges within the prison as well. So it's very difficult in that way. And then, you know, when it comes to sexual violence, especially as Ashley indicated with the statistics about sexual violence within the prisons, not only was I an advocate within the prisons working with the other inmates, but I've witnessed myself, you know, transgender folk, especially, who were being discriminated against because, you know, staff would be using their dead name and failing to call them by their pronouns, their proper pronouns, and then standing around laughing about it in front of them. And, you know, it's quite disturbing to know that these people who are in a position of authority are, you know, discriminating against people inside, and then not to mention doing it in front of other people that are incarcerated there, and, you know, showing that that's okay for everyone to do. And so reporting any acts of violence against people from the 2SLGBTQ community or anything is very difficult, because often staff just laugh about it. They don't believe you anyways. And that is something that I experienced myself with, you know, hearing about other women who were being sexually assaulted by a particular guard within the institution where I was housed. And, you know, there was another advocate that I worked with who was approached by one of the victims, and they went to staff, and the staff wrote up a report and brought it to upper management and was told to hide the report. And it turns out that this same guard had sexually assaulted somebody years prior, and they shipped that person off to another, to a psychiatric center across the country, and, you know, told her she was lying and making things up. And, you know, upon trying to come back, was forced to sit and apologize to this person. And then also, you know, another one that I witnessed myself, being sexually coerced into things with this guard. And I approached the warden myself and brought it to their attention and had specific dates and times and evidence, and was told, well, you know what our staffing issues like right now, Sarah, I'd prefer not to investigate this, but rather confront them on the fact that if someone chooses to blackmail him with this information, it could cost him his career, and hopefully that would stop the behavior. And this was just shocking and appalling, and I was so disgusted by this. And then it happened to me by the same perpetrator. And so I automatically went into advocacy mode. I'm like, I need to collect evidence. I need to find solid proof so that I can put a stop to this. And that's what I did. And when I came forward, then it was only then that action was taken, and not even, you know, action that would be considered reasonable, because, you know, there was no there was no action taken about the criminal activity that happened, nothing like that. And, that's when, thankfully working with organizations out in the community and having those connections and being an advocate for the Elizabeth Fry Society, mainland, I was able to, work with them and put a stop to this. And it was very difficult because, first of all, as a lesbian who has been sexually assaulted by a male, it's very difficult because, you get a lot of, people saying, oh, well, that can't be true because they're a lesbian, or why would they even want to do that to someone like that? And, so you're automatically not believed because of your sexual orientation. And so it was very difficult, but I knew that I had to be strong and I had to be a voice for those who were being dismissed and those who weren't being believed. And that's what I did. So my advocacy work continued on throughout my stay there, and especially with this. So working with, now upon my release, I continued to work in the community. And I'm very fortunate to have, Coverdale Courtwork Society, where I work, a big part of my life. And I'm able to continue my work from inside and not leave anybody behind, because there's people in there that are still going through all the monstrosities and the trauma and everything. So coming out here and being able to have the full support of organizations like Coverdale, where I work, Elizabeth Fry Society, where I work, these people allow me to continue my work and they support me in it. And I can actually say that I'm allowed to still be a voice for those people left inside. And that's a huge honor. So that brings me to this other work that I'm doing out here in, what happened with me and the victims in the institution by this one guard is just a small fraction of what actually happens throughout all the institutions designated for women across Canada. So working with CASE, the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, as well as Mike Dahl at Avalon Legal, we've launched a national class action lawsuit. And with this, it's a proposed class action that's been started on behalf of all current and former prisoners of federal correctional institutions designated for women who have been subjected to sexual assault or the threat of sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and or sex-based discrimination perpetrated by correctional staff and or management. And this is huge because we know that this happens. And upon all our work going into this, to launch this, we've also discovered Correctional Service Canada doesn't keep data on employees who have been criminally charged. And that's disturbing. But knowing what I know from the work I've done inside and from working on this, it doesn't surprise me, because with the internal investigation, when I came forward about the sexual assaults happening within the institution in Nova Scotia, Nova, I discovered that the internal investigation has nothing to do with the criminal aspect of what was happening. It's an internal investigation to determine employment. And what they do is they don't necessarily fire the person. What they might do is move them to another area of the prison or move them to another prison altogether. But that allows them to continue to victimize and traumatize people. And that's very disturbing, because even with my case, how many women did it happen to before me for years? And that's where the negligence comes in. CSC was aware of this happening. CSC had reports from staff that this was happening, and they chose to hide it, and they chose to ignore it, and they allowed this person to continue to victimize, traumatize, and assault women within the institution. And to me, that's unacceptable. So this national class action lawsuit that we've launched, CAFE has been supportive and involved as a wraparound service. And these are things that are vitally important for victims that are going to come forward. And we'll get into that more with some of the questions as well, because there's some points on that I could address when I'm answering some of the questions. So I think that's about it for that part. Ashley?
Sara, thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. There's a lot to learn from that. And the advocacy work that you're doing now is so amazing. I am particularly interested in the differences you described between like the workplace employment investigation and the criminal investigation, and thought that was a really important point for us to consider as we try and make systemic change in these systems which often perpetrate a lot of harm and violence. There's a lot of gratitude and appreciation for you and your story in the chat box that I just wanted to highlight, as well as for the background and research that you shared, Ash. There are a lot of questions about the slide deck. Ash provided an email, but I'm thinking that an easier way to get these slides out might be if, Ash, you send them to me and I can send them in a link, which will go in a follow email that Zoom automatically sends out. So if you're okay with that, that might be a way to get them out.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions that I would love to hear from you about, and I'll also invite questions from the attendees, which again, you can put either in the chat box or the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom screen. My first question is about survivors that you work with, so 2SLGBTQ folks who are incarcerated, and what you think they would want service providers to know about their experiences. So what are the things that we need to continue to learn about?
I'll start off by answering with, the first and foremost is that they need you to know that they're being truthful. This happens, and when they're coming to you, that means that they're in a place where they don't need to be dismissed. They don't need to be turned away. They need to be embraced and believed. And that's where the trust is going to start. Your reaction and how you encounter with that person is going to determine whether or not they're going to completely shut down and continue to be victimized and traumatized, or whether or not they're going to be able to open up and resolve this. Another important thing is a trauma-informed approach. There's so many places out there that are really embracing trauma-informed therapy and trauma-informed approaches. Coverdale, Elizabeth Fry are some of those. I'm signed up to take training with for survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse, so that I can better provide my services to victims on a more trauma-informed level. And there's so many organizations out there that provide that kind of training, which is great. Another thing is not to try and pull for information. I mean, when I first came forward with the evidence that actually put a stop to this predator within Nova institution, that I knew about the other victims, but never once did I go up to them and say, hey, I know what happened to you, it happened to me. what I did instead was I sat down with each one of them in regular conversation. I said, you don't have to answer anything, but I heard some things, and you don't have to say anything, you don't have to open up, but I just want you to know I believe you, and I'm here if you need to talk. And in each case, the victim started opening up to me. Then I was able to direct them to resources that were available to help them through this, but never say, oh, you need to go to this person. I said, well, in case you would like to explore things further or get more information or talk to someone, here's some further information. Here's someone you can talk to. And they would come back to me and say, would you come with me? I sat through interviews with these other victims, and, and that was part of my healing as well, because this took such a toll on my mental health and my well-being when this happened to me. I went from being this powerhouse of an advocate to that childlike victim from all the trauma from my past. I was sold into the sex trade by my father at a very young age, the age of 3. It continued till 15 with a small break when he shot himself when I was 8, but then the courts gave me back. That triggered all that trauma. And so I know from my own experiences that I just look at how I would want to be approached and how I would want somebody to engage with me. And that's what I did. And so I went from this powerhouse of an advocate doing all this wonderful work inside to this victim who was so childlike and damaged and wasn't sleeping and, PTSD and everything. And not to mention when I came forward with the evidence, let me just say, the first things they said is, what can we do, Sara, to help you through this? And I immediately said, I want access to the Colchester Sexual Assault Center for trauma-informed therapy. And they said, we'll make it happen. It never did. The 5 years that I was incarcerated in Nova Institution, I fought for them to be following what the creative choices outlined, which was community access for women to have these resources and utilize them. Who wants to go see mental health within the facility when there's CSC employees who are going to report everything back? You can't heal that way. So there was no healing. And when I talked to the mental health there about wanting trauma-informed therapy, they said, we don't offer that because we don't want to open that doorway and then send you back to your room with no follow-up. And my response to that was, but it's okay for one of your employees to be the perpetrator of that trauma and you send me back to my room with no follow-up. This is the kind of thing that goes on. So, it was very important for me after quite a few months of being that hollow shell that was just so damaged and traumatized. I thought, you know what? I know how I can heal from this. I need to be strong. I need to be that voice for the victims who don't have a voice for themselves because they've already been dismissed. They've already been told they were lying. There was no investigations, no follow-up. There was no help for these people. And I had to be strong and continue to be that voice so that I can help them. And that helped me heal. Coming out into the community, launching this national class action lawsuit. This is all about making legislature changes, about making policy changes, about making endemic and systemic changes. This is about me changing the way things are handled so that no further women will be victimized and traumatized in the way I was due to the negligence of the Correctional Service of Canada. They violated our human rights. And, this is to hold them accountable, but on a more important level, making those systemic changes to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Yeah. And I'm all about, I'm a prison abolitionist. And the reason why is because if these resources and these community organizations would be funded properly in the first place, you wouldn't need prisons because people would get the help that they need. I look at people that are sit inside prisons and I don't see criminals. I don't see bad people. I see victims who have been let down and failed by society, by their communities, by their environment, by their government. These are victims. Yeah. What they need is to be embraced. They need to be helped. They need to be listened to. They need to be heard. They need to heal. And they're not going to get that inside the walls of a prison. And it's so important that we start funding the community resources that are out there. And I'm a big, huge advocate and promoter of trauma-informed therapy. It's so important to me. I see a trauma-informed therapist every 2 weeks to deal with everything, and I'm going to continue to do that for a very long time, because taking on this role, I see comments, I see people putting comments out there saying, oh, who would want to rape her? She's too fat and ugly. Things like that. You know what? I'm not doing this and so that I can get monetary gain out of it. I'm not doing this so that I can be out there and get attention. I'm doing this so that those comments that are directed at me aren't directed at the other victims. My face is out there so that I can protect the other people who may not come forward for fear of hearing those things about themselves. They don't have to now. My face is out there, and guess what? I'm strong enough, I'm courageous enough, and I've got big shoulders, but most importantly, I've got the most incredible network of supports that anybody could ever ask for, because I choose to surround myself with people who care about me, love me, support me, and are always there when I need them. So I don't know how we're doing on time.
That's really beautiful, Sara. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's hundreds of really important points that you shared with us there for us all to reflect on. The importance of a believing, supportive response, the importance of healing and being able to access the services and supports that are needed, rooted in the community, and the importance of being involved in this work as a survivor and having that expertise really be honored, acknowledged, and used to create that systemic change. So I really want to thank you for sharing your experience and those important points for us to remember. I have another question, which is, what can service providers do, either on an individual level or organizationally, to better support 2SLGBTQ survivors that are or have been incarcerated?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think that the main problem, well, one of the main problems with prisons and jails is that they invisibilize these types of problems. So organizations or individuals who are not in direct contact with people in prisons and jails forget that these types of issues exist, and that there are people experiencing things like sexualized violence in provincial or federal prisons and jails. So that's number one, is just being aware and finding ways to, really center the voices of those people. And that's what we tried to do with our research project, is really to provide a space for people to come forward, to share their experiences, to share their stories, in particular for the 2SLGBTQ population, who in many ways are multiply their oppression is multiplied and made worse because of the prison system. So that, I mean, that would be my first suggestion, is just to know that this issue exists and to find ways to learn from the people who are, you know, involved in the criminal justice system and who have experiences to sort of share. I guess, you know, just deepening knowledge more broadly about the relationships between the carceral system and queer and trans identities and how that relates to sexualized violence. You know, from an organizational perspective, reviewing internal policies and practices around how organizations rely on the criminal justice system, and really being critical of that system and acknowledging that certainly the people that we spoke with in our research find little, if any, redress in that system. And so thinking more expansively about how people can find justice and what that really means for them beyond sort of the criminal legal system as it exists. And also, organizations, you know, if they don't already, should think more critically about policies around inclusion for trans folks and gender diverse people. So in particular, women's organizations, you know, acknowledging that this is a population that has historically been left out of services and supports, particularly in the women's sector. So looking at how to make sure that trans and gender non-binary people are included. And then just, you know, connecting into the work that's already happening. So, you know, I always say organizations who are providing services in the community should always think about ways to extend those services into prisons and jails, while also trying to sort of move for decarceration of people. So recognizing that it's, you know, it's really difficult, as Sara, you know, told us, it's difficult to find the proper support and services in these facilities. So, you know, by creating transformative justice initiatives in our community where people can find healing, that really is where we need to go, but also as sort of a harm reduction approach, recognizing that services in the community should also be extended to those inside. So yeah, those are just some of my preliminary thoughts.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Ash. A lot of really important points there for us to continue learning and be as inclusive as possible and ensure that our community services are available to everyone who needs them and reflect on how they can be as inclusive as possible is a really important reminder. So I want to thank you, Sara and Ash, so much for being our first Lunch and Learn Bringing Down Barriers Sexual Assault Awareness Month series panelists. And I want to thank all of the attendees for making time today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you at the next one.
Thanks, Dee.
Thanks, Dee.